Immediately asserting central control, white aims to restrict black's development and build a strong pawn presence. Developing a knight to f6, this move immediately challenges white's central ambition and prepares for kingside castling, offering flexibility in the ensuing skirmish. Pioneering central space, white asserts control and prepares for further pawn advances, aiming to squeeze black's development. Embracing the king's Indian defense, this flexible pawn structure prepares for a dynamic fight where piece activity often outweighs immediate pawn structure weaknesses. Paving the way for the king's bishop to eye the long diagonal, this maneuver strategically restricts black's fianchetto. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop solidifies the kingside and prepares for central development. Solidifying the fianchetto and preparing for kingside castling, this bishop prepares for future central action. Boldly challenging the center, black initiates a dynamic pawn struggle and seeks to unravel white's compact structure. Striking at the center, white immediately challenges black's pawn chain, opening lines for active piece play. Reclaiming the pawn centralizes the knight, setting the stage for a dynamic central skirmish. Developing the knight to c3 now prepares to contest the central d5 square and supports a potential e4 advance, aiming to generate more space and activity for white's pieces. Asserting control over the vital c4 square and preparing to eye the queenside, this maneuver prepares for potential pawn advances like b5 or even a knight's reshuffling towards the center, aiming to diffuse white's central pawn structure. Solidifying the central pawn chain, this solidifies white's central presence and prepares to develop the queen's knight to a more harmonious square, potentially b3 to support the c4 pawn or even a3 if the knight needs to retreat. Securing the monarch is paramount, and castling achieves this crucial defensive objective while simultaneously activating a rook, preparing it for potential central action or bolstering the pawn chain support. Preparing to shift the knight to a more active square, potentially to f4 or even d4, to challenge black's central control and support an eventual kingside pawn push. Unlocking a queenside avenue, this pawn's march aims to challenge white's control over the queenside majority and prepare for potential piece activity along the file. Consolidating pawn structure and preparing for future queenside expansion, this move subtly reinforces the central foothold while eyeing the potential for a c5 push down the line. Unlocking central mobility, this knight aims to exploit the e4 square and reinforce the d5 outpost, subtly challenging white's pawn structure and setting the stage for potential pawn breaks or piece maneuvers that will demand white's immediate attention. Castling unlocks the king's safety and prepares to activate the rook on the f-file, aiming for the d8 square or supporting a central pawn push. A bold pawn thrust, aiming to shatter the central pawn structure and open lines for your pieces. This immediately creates dynamic imbalances, forcing white to consider whether to capture, advance, or retreat. The success of this ambitious gambit hinges on your ability to exploit the ensuing complications and develop active piece play before white can consolidate their advantage. Seizing central space aggressively, white pushes the d-pawn to establish a dominant pawn chain and restrict black's queenside development, creating immediate strategic dilemmas for black. Unleashing a knight to b4 immediately disrupts white's central pawn chain and introduces fascinating tactical possibilities, forcing an immediate reckoning with the exposed c-pawn. Asserting control over the c4 square and forcing the knight to retreat, white strategically aims to restrict black's central influence and prevent further pawn advancements. A bold repositioning now immediately challenges white's pawn chain and aims to infiltrate the queenside, seeking squares like c5 or b4 to disrupt white's queenside expansion and potentially create weaknesses for the b3 pawn. Pivoting the central pawn structure, white ignites a strategic battle for the d-file, immediately confronting black's knight on b4 and creating potential lines of attack towards the queenside while simultaneously solidifying their own central control. Unleashing a dynamic pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's central pawn chain and opens a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, aiming to create chaos and disrupt white's harmonious setup. This aggressive initiative signifies a bold attempt to seize the initiative and exploit the slightly cramped nature of white's queenside pawns. Capturing the pawn opens the e-file, which could become a crucial artery for white's pieces to penetrate black's kingside if the pawns on the kingside become unstable. Unveiling the pawn structure's secrets, this recapture immediately alters the central pawn landscape, opening the g-file for immediate aggressive potential while simultaneously weakening the kingside pawn shield. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, f4 boldly seeks to shatter black's central structure and create attacking chances, gambling on the potential for open lines towards the enemy monarch while accepting a slight pawn weakness on e3. Black boldly advances the pawn, seizing central space and preparing to challenge white's advanced kingside pawn chain, a bold gambit for initiative. Bolstering the central pawn chain and preparing for potential kingside expansion, this move thoughtfully repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside while maintaining vigilance over the central dark squares. Activating the queen on the d6 square, the queen now eyes the central pawn chain and prepares to support the coming advance on the kingside. White seizes control of the open c-file, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive pawn structure and prepare for potential pressure along this critical corridor. The bishop tucks away, a defensive maneuver seeking shelter behind the pawn chain, while simultaneously eyeing the central tension and potentially preparing for an eventual c5 break to challenge white's kingside space advantage. Launching a pawn storm on the kingside, white boldly aims to shatter black's castled fortress, creating dynamic complications and potential weaknesses for the opposing monarch. Exploiting the newly opened kingside, black aggressively strikes at the pawn chain's weak point, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially expose the monarch. Suddenly, the central tension explodes, and white sacrifices the knight to pry open the kingside. This bold gambit aims to exploit the exposed black king by creating immediate threats along the newly opened diagonals and the semi-open f-file. Observe how this seemingly reckless exchange reroutes white's forces, forcing black into a defensive posture to consolidate. Embracing chaos, black seeks to exploit the newly opened e-file and the exposed white king. Here's a breakdown of why 19. QG6 is a fascinating choice, focusing on the strategic implications and potential consequences. Asterisk. Initiating counterplay on an open file. Asterisk by bringing the queen to g6, black immediately eyes the g-file, which has just been opened by white's pawn push. This is a critical development, as open files are prime real estate for aggressive pieces, especially queens and rooks. The queen on g6 is poised to participate in attacks on the white king's position. Challenging white's central dominance, white has achieved a strong central pawn structure after 19. nxc4. Black's queen move is a direct challenge to this dominance, aiming to create imbalances and prevent white from consolidating their advantage comfortably. Increased king vulnerability, with the e-file open and white's pieces potentially needing to defend against attacks on the g-file, the white king's safety becomes a growing concern. The queen on g6 directly targets this vulnerability. Creating tactical possibilities, this move opens up a range of tactical opportunities. Black might be looking for sacrifices, forks, or simply overwhelming pressure that white will struggle to parry effectively. The position is becoming very sharp. A bold, aggressive stance, rather than passively defending, black chooses an active and aggressive response, aiming to dictate the play and create complications. This is a hallmark of dynamic chess. Sacrificing pawn structure for initiative, while black has a somewhat compromised pawn structure on the kingside, the queen maneuver aims to trade that positional concession for significant attacking initiative. The question is whether this trade will pay off. Testing white's defensive capabilities, the move forces white to react and demonstrate their defensive mettle. Can white withstand the incoming storm, or will they buckle under the pressure? In essence, 19. QG6 is a declaration of intent. Black is not afraid of the current complexities and is ready to embrace a sharp, tactical battle. It's a move that promises an exciting continuation of the game. Liberating the knight from its passive square, This maneuver aims to redeploy it to a more active role, potentially supporting a central pawn advance or targeting black's somewhat exposed kingside. Observe how the queenside defense now becomes a key consideration, as the knight's departure from the kingside may open avenues for black's pieces. White is betting that the initiative gained from this repositioning outweighs any temporary weaknesses that might arise. Reclaiming the initiative, black brings the rook to the open e-file, challenging white's central pawn structure and preparing to exploit the weakened kingside after the recent pawn skirmishes. Seizing the initiative, white aims to destabilize black's central pawn structure, while probing for weaknesses around the king. Instantly simplifying the position, black removes a potentially problematic knight, aiming to disrupt white's central control and open lines that might favor his own pieces in the ensuing middle game. This queen maneuver dramatically reshapes the central battleground, immediately challenging black's isolated pawn on e4 and preparing to exploit the open d-file. White is aiming to consolidate after the recent pawn exchange, hoping to activate their queen as a central force, potentially supporting an advance on the kingside or pressuring the weak pawns that may arise from black's aggressive pawn play. The king's safety for both sides remains a key consideration, and this queen's repositioning adds another layer of dynamic pressure to the unfolding tactics. Black retreats the knight, seeking refuge from the aggressive pawn push and white's open king's diagonal, but this redeployment significantly weakens the queenside pawn structure and concedes valuable space, potentially leading to a constricted position where maneuvering becomes difficult. Opening a diagonal for the queen and creating attacking prospects on the kingside, this pawn thrust aggressively challenges black's central structure and seeks to exploit the weakened e4 square. Consider the tactical implications. If black allows the pawn to advance further, white could gain significant control of the e4 square, potentially pinning pieces and restricting black's mobility. This move also aims to generate space for white's pieces, particularly the king's bishop, which could become more active on the now open diagonals. The immediate threat is forcing black to react and potentially concede more positional concessions. However, be mindful of the positional cost. Pushing the f-pawn creates a potential weakness on the g4 square if black can find a way to attack it later. The long-term consequences of this pawn sacrifice, or aggressive pawn push, will depend heavily on black's response and white's ability to follow up effectively. It's a bold attempt to seize the initiative, but requires careful calculation to ensure the compensation is sufficient. The initiative shifts dramatically as black repositions the queen, not merely to a safer square, but to a position that actively eyes white's weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially opens lines for attack. This maneuver signals a willingness to engage in tactical skirmishes, forcing white to carefully calculate defensive continuations or face further complications. Pouncing on the open g-file, this audacious advance aims to shatter black's pawn shield and expose their monarch, a bold attempt to inject immediate tactical chaos into the position. Seeking to untangle the cramped kingside and potentially activate the rooks, the black king ventures towards the center, a bold maneuver that risks exposure but promises more active defense if white overextends. The knight's retreat to f2 signals a strategic repositioning, aiming to reinforce the kingside and prepare for a potential kingside assault by doubling rooks on the f-file or shifting to the g-file for an attack on the weakened g6 pawn, while also providing an escape square for the king should the central pawn structure collapse. Seizing the open queen's file and challenging white's central grip becomes paramount now, as the bishop on e3 is temporarily pinned and the kingside is becoming a dangerous zone for the white monarch. The queen's trade, simplifying the position and ushering in an endgame where white hopes to exploit the slightly compromised black king's safety, though black's active pieces and open files present significant counterplay. Opening the c-file, black reclaims central influence and prepares to contest it, though the pawn chain now feels more static. Repositioning the knight to a more active central square, this maneuver aims to exploit the potential weakness on d6 and prepare for future attacks. Reclaiming the e-file with the rook signals, a renewed attempt to exploit the weakened dark squares and open lines around white's monarch. Refocusing the bishop to control the light squares, especially the critical d6 and e7 squares, now that the queens are off the board. Unshackling the rook from its defensive post on the back rank opens crucial avenues for counterplay, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed white king and the dangling pawn on f5. Seizing the open file is the immediate priority after the exchange, potentially opening a direct assault on the black king's defenses. A doubling of pawns on the b-file, necessitated by the capture, fundamentally alters the structure, creating an isolated doubled pawn that will forever demand support and potentially become a weakness in the ensuing endgame. Suddenly, a decisive pawn push opens a critical diagonal towards black's beleaguered king, threatening to unravel its defenses and exploit the weakened squares surrounding it. A pivotal decision looms as black reroutes the rook to the newly opened d-file, aiming to contest central control and potentially unburden the d6 pawn, though it sacrifices an immediate tempo and risks allowing white's king to become more active through kingside pawn pushes. Unleashing the rook onto the g-file immediately disrupts black's nascent counterplay, aiming to exploit the exposed kingside and potentially open lines towards the monarch. Initiating a decisive pawn sacrifice, black boldly aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and exploit the weakened dark squares around the king, hoping to create active counterplay with the bishop. Reclaiming the open file is paramount now. You're essentially fighting for breathing room and to challenge black's already established presence. Relocating the king to the center, key 6 asterisk exposes it to immense pressure from white's pieces, particularly the rook on g4 and the now active knight on e4, while doing little to support the beleaguered queenside pawn structure. Challenging the pinned knight directly, this audacious check leverages the pressure on black's crippled kingside, aiming to disrupt any defensive cohesion and capitalize on the exposed king. The king's relocation to f6 appears somewhat perilous given the open g-file and the menacing knight on g5, but it also prepares to contest the crucial d6 pawn and potentially activate the rook. Unleashing a powerful knight sacrifice to shatter the enemy's pawn shield and expose their weakened monarch. This audacious thrust aims to break open lines leading to the king and initiate a decisive attack by bringing white's remaining forces into the fray. The black king, exposed and adrift after the recent exchanges, now vacates the precarious central square, a necessary retreat to avoid the immediate checkmate threat. But it opens up further avenues for the white knights to exploit and disrupts any lingering hope of coordinated defense. Chasing the enemy monarch into a tight spot with this knight check forces the black king further into confinement, preparing to trap it and potentially create decisive breakthroughs. The king bravely steps back into the fray, seeking shelter amidst the storm. White's king hunt, however, seems to have lost its initial steam with that last knight sacrifice, potentially allowing black to regroup and leverage the open files. Initiating a tactical dance of knights, this checking maneuver seeks to dislodge the black king from its relative safety and exploit the king's exposure on the kingside. Initiating a sequence of forcing checks, the black king is compelled to participate in this dangerous dance, sacrificing tempo for survival. Seizing the open file with the knight creates immediate pressure on the isolated pawn, potentially unraveling black's weakened queenside pawn structure. Reclaiming the passed pawn simplifies the material and opens a crucial file for your rook, potentially targeting white's underdeveloped pieces. Unleashing a knight check, white aims to disrupt black's king's precarious safety and perhaps force further pawn weaknesses or material exchanges, hoping to capitalize on the exposed royal. Navigating this chaotic, material-imbalanced middle game demands immense calculation. Returning the king to the center, while seemingly counterintuitive with the opponent's knight so active, could be a shrewd attempt to activate black's own pieces from their passive positions, hoping to exploit any lingering weaknesses around white's king, or potentially force a trade to simplify into a more manageable endgame. Seeking to exploit the exposed black king, white initiates a decisive sequence with this aggressive knight sortie. The black king now stands exposed in the center, an inviting target for the white knights. Black must prioritize its safety by retreating or finding defensive cover. A daring repositioning, seeking to activate the rook on the open file and potentially apply pressure on black's king, though it leaves the knight temporarily exposed. The king now bravely steps into the fray, attempting to stir up some counterplay amidst the queenless chaos, aiming to disrupt white's piece coordination and perhaps find refuge on the king side. Unleashing a sudden royal check, white exploits the exposed black king's precarious position and seeks to disrupt its sanctuary. The king is now forced to wander into the open files, surrendering its last shred of safety amidst the opposing piece's menacing advance. Activating the rook on the 7th rank creates immediate pressure and seeks to exploit black's slightly uncoordinated pieces, aiming to disrupt their defensive structure around the king. Asserting central control and preparing to contest the open files, this maneuver simultaneously shores up the weakened kingside structure. Sacrificing the d-pawn opens up the 7th rank for the rook, transforming it into a potent attacker on a critical file. Navigating the past pawn's advance to d7, black brings the knight back from its wanderings, aiming to solidify the weakened queenside pawn structure and potentially offer some support for future defense of the 7th rank. The monarch is forced to dance towards the edge of the board under this relentless pressure. The crucial squares around the black king are dangerously exposed, so securing that royal presence with a protective maneuver is paramount. Sharpening the attack and forcing the black king into an even more precarious position, this check aims to disrupt any hope of respite for the monarch, driving it toward the edge of the board and potentially exposing it to further threats. Relinquishing the central file allows white to centralize the rook, creating immediate threats against black's vulnerable king. Exploiting the open file, the rook relentlessly drives the enemy king, seeking to force a decisive weakness. The king's desperate scramble for safety, aiming to occupy the A8 square, offers a fleeting moment of respite but ultimately leads it into a compromised position, unable to offer meaningful support to its remaining pieces as the white rook now controls a crucial open file. The rook decisively claims the open 7th rank, aiming to restrict black's counterplay and create mating threats against the exposed king. Sensing a glimmer of hope, black desperately checks to disrupt white's encroaching queen. The knight's repositioning aims to exploit the open g-file and its potential for supporting a pawn push, while simultaneously threatening to infiltrate black's weakened king defenses.